Chapter 1: Why Mental Models Matter. Think for a moment about how you see the world. When you look at your phone, the person across from you, or the city you live in, what are you really seeing? Is it reality itself, or is it reality filtered through your mind? This question touches on one of life's deepest secrets. We don't see the world as it is. We see the world as we are. And who we are is largely shaped by our mental models. Mental models are frameworks of understanding that we carry in our minds about how the world works. They are thought structures that simplify complex reality and help us make sense of it. Think of a map in your hand. This map isn't the actual territory, but a representation, a model of the terrain. Yet with a good map, you can reach your destination without getting lost. Mental models work the same way. They're not reality itself, but tools that help us navigate reality. The fascinating thing is that you already have dozens, perhaps hundreds, of mental models operating in your mind right now. Some you're aware of, most you're not. They're like the operating system of your brain, running quietly in the background, shaping every thought, every decision, every action you take. Every day you use mental models without realizing it. At breakfast, when you think, if I eat protein, I'll stay full until lunch, that's a model built from your experiences with nutrition. In traffic, when you calculate, if I take this route at this hour, I'll save 20 minutes, you're running a mental simulation based on patterns you've internalized. At work, when you decide, I need to be kind but firm with this client, you're applying a model about human relationships and communication. But here's what most people don't realize: these models don't just shape your thoughts, they shape what you actually perceive. They determine what you notice and what you overlook, what seems important and what seems trivial, what appears as an opportunity and what appears as a threat. In the 1990s, psychologists at Harvard University conducted what would become one of the most famous experiments in cognitive psychology. They showed people a video of a basketball game with one simple task: count the number of passes made by the team in white shirts. The participants focused intently, carefully tracking each pass. When the video ended, the researchers asked how many passes they counted. Everyone had an answer. Then came the second question: did you see the gorilla? More than half the participants stared in confusion. What gorilla? The researchers played the video again, and this time the participants watched in stunned disbelief. Right in the middle of the game, someone in a full gorilla costume walks onto the court, stops in the center, beats their chest, and walks off. 9 full seconds on screen. Yet more than half the observers had completely missed it. This experiment, known as the invisible gorilla, teaches us something profound about human perception. We don't see everything that's there. Our attention is limited, and what we focus on is determined by our mental models, our expectations, our frameworks for understanding what's important. The participants had a model: I'm watching a basketball game and counting passes. This model directed their attention so completely that an anomalous gorilla simply didn't register. Their brains filtered it out as irrelevant. Your brain receives approximately 11 million bits of information per second from your senses, but your conscious mind can only process about 40 bits per second. That means 99.99996% of sensory information available to you is filtered out before it reaches your conscious awareness. What determines which 40 bits you process? Your mental models. They act as filters, deciding what's signal and what's noise. Consider what happens when a real estate agent, an architect, and a gardener look at the same house. The real estate agent walks through calculating square footage, location analysis, comparable sales, potential market value. The architect sees structural elements, load-bearing walls, natural light, spatial flow, design opportunities. The gardener focuses on soil composition, drainage patterns, sun exposure, what could thrive there. Same house, 3 radically different experiences of seeing it. Not because one is right and the other's wrong, but because each is equipped with different mental models that highlight different aspects of reality. So here's the question: through which models are you viewing your life, your work, your relationships? And more importantly, are those models serving you well, or limiting what you can see and achieve? Every decision you make is the product of mental models operating in your mind. But most of the time, we're completely unaware of which models we're using. They operate automatically, invisibly, shaping our choices without our conscious participation. This unconsciousness is dangerous because it means we're often applying the wrong models to our situations, leading to poor decisions and disappointing outcomes. Let's say you're preparing for an important job interview. If you unconsciously apply a model that says, "This is a competition, there's one winner and one loser, the interviewer is trying to catch me out," you'll walk intense and defensive. You'll see every question as a trap. You'll give cliché answers about weaknesses and deflect blame when discussing failures. You'll be performing rather than connecting. The interviewer will sense your inauthenticity and worry about whether you can accept feedback or work authentically with a team. But if you apply a different model, one that says, "This is a matching process, both sides are looking for good fit, the best outcome is an accurate match," everything changes. You walk in relaxed and genuine. You share real areas you're working to improve. You describe what went wrong in past projects and what you learned. The interviewer appreciates your honesty and self-awareness. Same situation, two different models, completely different outcomes. Or consider a delayed project at work. If your model is, "When things go wrong, someone is responsible, we need to find who made the mistake," you'll create a tense meeting where everyone is defensive and pointing fingers. Even if you identify the person responsible, you haven't solved anything systemically. But if your model is "Problems emerge from system dynamics, multiple factors interact to create outcomes," your questions change. What factors contributed to this delay? Was our initial timeline realistic? Did we have adequate communication? Were there unforeseen dependencies? Now people relax and share real information. You discover the delay resulted from multiple factors: optimistic estimates, a team member pulled to another emergency, piecemeal client feedback, inadequate project management tools. With these insights, you can actually improve the system. Same problem, two models, completely different processes and outcomes. Now let's address what it costs us to think without good mental models. The costs are enormous, though often invisible. We pay them every day in the form of repeated mistakes, missed opportunities, wasted energy, and suboptimal outcomes. Without mental models, we struggle to learn from experience. We might have an experience, even a painful one, but we don't extract the underlying pattern. So when a similar situation arises later, we don't recognize it and make the same mistake again. Consider someone who keeps experiencing the same problem in relationships. The beginning is wonderful, intense connection, everything feels perfect. Then gradually, their partner becomes distant, needs space, feels suffocated. The relationship ends with, "You're amazing, but I need someone more independent." This happens 4 times, but they don't see the pattern. Each relationship failed for different reasons, they think. Then they encounter the concept of attachment styles in psychology. They learn that people develop different patterns of attachment based on how caregivers responded to their needs in childhood. Some develop secure attachment, comfortable with both intimacy and independence. Others develop anxious attachment, craving closeness and fearing abandonment. Still others develop avoidant attachment, valuing independence and feeling uncomfortable with too much closeness. Suddenly they recognize themselves, anxious attachment. When they care about someone, they become hypervigilant to signs of distance, seek constant reassurance, inadvertently push for more closeness than partners are comfortable with. This creates a dynamic where they pursue and their partner withdraws, increasing anxiety, increasing pursuit, in a self-reinforcing cycle. This mental model suddenly makes their relationship history make sense. Now that they see the pattern, they can work on it. Without the model, they might repeat the same pattern for their entire life. Another cost is solving the wrong problems. Without good models, we mistake symptoms for root causes. We put enormous effort into addressing surface issues while leaving underlying problems untouched. A company's sales decline for 6 consecutive quarters. The most obvious observation is that the sales team isn't meeting quotas, so they conclude our problem is sales performance. They implement sales training, higher quotas, aggressive commissions, they fire bottom performers and hire new people. The sales team works evenings and weekends, stressed and exhausted. But sales continue declining. Why? They were solving the wrong problem. An investigation reveals the real issue: the market has shifted, customer needs have evolved, and the company's product is no longer aligned with what customers want. Competitors have introduced products addressing new priorities. No amount of sales training will fix this. The problem isn't sales execution, it's product market fit. This diagnosis requires mental models like systems thinking, root cause analysis, market dynamics. Without these models, you solve the wrong problem, waste resources, demoralize employees, and continue declining. Perhaps the most expensive cost is invisible: opportunities we never see, possibilities that never occur to us, value we never create because we can't perceive it. Let me tell you about one of the most famous examples in business history. In 1975, a 24-year-old engineer named Steve Sasson, working in Kodak's research lab, invented the first digital camera. It was crude, weighed 8 pounds, recorded to cassette tape, took 23 seconds to capture a single black and white image at 0.01 megapixels. But it worked. It was the world's first digital camera. Sasson excitedly presented his invention to Kodak executives. Their response? Polite interest, followed by a decision to suppress the technology. They literally shelved it. Why would a photography company reject revolutionary photography technology? Because of their mental model. Kodak's leadership believed: we are in the film business, our products are film and photo paper, our profits come from chemistry, people buy cameras once but buy film repeatedly, digital photography would cannibalize our film business. This model was accurate in describing Kodak's current business, but fatally limited. It defined Kodak by what they made rather than what they did for customers. Meanwhile, other companies developed digital photography without the baggage of a film business to protect. They saw digital as a better way to capture images. By the 2000s, digital photography had killed the film business, including Kodak's. In 2012, Kodak filed for bankruptcy. The company that invented digital photography was destroyed by it. If Kodak's leadership had operated with a different model: we help people capture and share important moments, they might have led the digital revolution. They had everything except the right mental model. Without efficient mental models, we also waste enormous energy reinventing the wheel constantly. We face each problem as if it's entirely new, failing to recognize patterns and apply proven solutions. Think about someone solving a programming problem who has never learned design patterns. Every time they encounter a common issue, they solve it from scratch. They might eventually arrive at a working solution, but it takes much longer and is likely inferior to established patterns refined over decades. Compare this to someone who has studied patterns. When they encounter a problem, they immediately recognize it and implement the proven solution quickly. Their mental model library makes them vastly more efficient. The same principle applies everywhere. A manager who never studied organizational psychology reinvents motivation strategies through trial and error. A parent who lacks models about child development struggles with each stage. An investor without models about market cycles is constantly surprised by predictable patterns. Finally, there's an emotional cost to operating without good mental models. When we don't understand what's happening or why, when events seem random and unpredictable, when we can't see patterns or anticipate outcomes, we feel out of control. This produces chronic stress and anxiety. Conversely, having good models produces confidence and calm. Even in uncertain situations, you can say, I don't know exactly what will happen, but I understand the dynamics at play, I can see the range of likely outcomes, I know which factors to monitor, I have tools to respond appropriately. This understanding reduces anxiety and increases well-being. Now let's turn to the positive. What do you gain by consciously building a rich library of mental models? The benefits are transformative and compound over time. Good mental models cut through confusion and provide clarity. They help you see what matters, understand why things happen, and predict what's likely to occur. Consider the Pareto principle, also known as the 80-20 rule. This simple model observes that in many domains, roughly 80% of effects come from 20% of causes. In business, 80% of revenue often comes from 20% of customers. In your wardrobe, you probably wear 20% of your clothes 80% of the time. Once you internalize this model, it transforms how you think about priorities. Instead of treating all tasks as equally important, you constantly ask, what's the vital 20% here? Which efforts will produce the most results? This single model can clarify decision-making across your entire life. Should you try to fix all issues or focus on the critical few? Should you improve all skills or double down on key strengths? Should you nurture all relationships equally or invest heavily in the most important? The Pareto principle doesn't answer these questions for you, but it provides a framework for thinking about them clearly. Multi-model thinking dramatically improves decision quality. Instead of viewing a situation through a single lens, you examine it from multiple perspectives, each revealing different aspects. Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger, perhaps the most successful investment partnership in history, explicitly attribute their success to multi-model thinking. When evaluating an investment, they don't just run financial models. They apply concepts from psychology, asking how cognitive biases might be affecting market pricing, what behavioral patterns the company's leaders exhibit, how incentives influence decision-making. They apply mathematics, using probability theory to understand ranges of outcomes and how compound returns work over different time horizons. They apply physics concepts like critical mass to network effects and momentum to business trends. They apply biology, considering how evolutionary concepts like competitive advantage and adaptation work in business. They apply history, asking whether similar situations have occurred before and what patterns repeat. By applying models from multiple disciplines, they see dimensions that purely financial analysis misses. They understand companies and markets more deeply, allowing better predictions and decisions. This approach isn't limited to investing. Any important decision benefits from multi-model analysis. Choosing a career? Apply models from economics like opportunity cost, psychology about strengths and fulfillment, systems thinking about how skills compound, and strategy about positioning yourself advantageously. A diverse toolkit of mental models makes you dramatically faster at solving problems because you can recognize patterns and apply proven solutions rather than figuring everything out from scratch. I heard about a product manager whose team built a new feature that user testing revealed was confusing. The team immediately started brainstorming redesigns, new layouts, different colors, revised copy. She stopped them. Before we redesign, let's apply first principles thinking, break this down to the most fundamental level and build back up. They asked, what is the actual user goal? What information do they need? What is the absolute minimum interface needed? They stripped away assumptions and rebuilt from basics. Within 30 minutes, they identified the core issue. They were asking users to make a decision before providing the information needed to make it. The solution wasn't about design aesthetics but information architecture. They reordered the flow and suddenly everything clicked. What could have been weeks of iteration took less than an hour because she applied a powerful mental model that cut straight to the root. Mental models don't let you predict the future, but they help you understand likely dynamics and prepare for multiple scenarios. Consider the model of incentive structures. As Charlie Munger says, show me the incentive and I'll show you the outcome. Once you understand this model, you can anticipate behavioral dynamics with remarkable accuracy. When a new policy or system is proposed, you ask, what is this incentivizing? What behavior will it encourage? What unintended consequences might emerge? When rideshare companies began offering bonuses for completing a certain number of rides per week, someone familiar with incentive models could predict drivers would reject long rides at week's end and accept only short rides to ensure they hit the bonus threshold. This is exactly what happened, creating poor user experience. Or consider regression to the mean, a statistical model observing that extreme outcomes tend to be followed by more moderate ones. If you understand this, you won't panic after an unusually bad quarter or become overconfident after an unusually good one. You understand some variation is random and exceptional periods tend to be followed by periods closer to average. Perhaps the most personally valuable benefit is that a rich library of mental models makes you feel more capable and less overwhelmed. When unexpected challenges arise, instead of panicking, you think, okay, this situation resembles X, that means Y is likely happening, I should try approach Z. Even facing something difficult, having frameworks to understand it reduces anxiety and increases agency. Years ago, I would feel acute stress when projects got complicated or situations became unclear. My mind would race, trying to figure out what was happening. After deliberately building mental models, my experience of challenges completely changed. Now, when something complex arises, I feel curiosity more than anxiety. My mind goes through a process. Which models apply here? What does systems thinking reveal? What does game theory suggest? What would second-order thinking indicate? I'm not panicking, I'm analyzing. That shift from reactive emotion to structured thinking makes an enormous difference in both experience and effectiveness. Perhaps the most powerful benefit is that mental models from different domains can be combined creatively, allowing you to see connections and possibilities others miss. Steve Jobs famously said creativity is just connecting things. Consider how evolution, a biological model, applies to business strategy. Companies compete for resources in environments. Those with better fit to their environment survive and thrive, those poorly adapted decline and die. Understanding evolution helps you think about business. What is our competitive advantage, our adaptation? What if the environment shifts through market change? How quickly can we adapt? What does the extinction of once dominant companies like Blockbuster and Nokia teach us about continuous adaptation? Or consider compound interest, a mathematical model applied to learning. Just as money compounds over time with reinvested interest, skills and knowledge compound when each thing you learn increases your capacity to learn more. This suggests focusing on building foundational mental models that serve as multipliers for everything else you learn. The ability to take models from one domain and apply them to another is one of the highest forms of intelligence and creativity. Here's the beautiful truth: you get to choose your mental models. You are not stuck with the hodgepodge collection of frameworks you've randomly accumulated. You can deliberately curate, build, and refine your thinking tools. Most people never realize this. They operate with whatever models they happen to absorb from their culture, education, and experience, some useful, some limiting, some actively harmful. They never question these models, never examine whether they serve them well, never deliberately upgrade them. But you're different now because you're aware, and awareness is the first step to transformation. From this point forward, you can become the architect of your own thinking. You can identify which models you currently use, evaluate whether they're serving you, discard ones that aren't, and deliberately acquire new ones that will make you more effective. So where do you start? The first step is awareness. Observe yourself this week. How do you make decisions? What assumptions guide you? What do you focus on? What do you ignore? At day's end, write 3 things: an important decision you made, the thinking framework you used, and what other perspective you could have taken. Then start systematically learning new models. Choose one model each month and study it in depth. What does this model explain? In which situations does it work? What are its limits? Where can you apply it in your life? Read, think, apply. Learning isn't enough though, you must practice. Consciously try to apply newly learned models to daily situations. At first it will be difficult and unnatural, but with practice, models become internalized and automatic. Finally, regularly reflect. Did this model work? What did you learn? When was it useful, when wasn't it? This reflection loop is the essence of wisdom, learning from experience consciously. Let me give you a few powerful models you can start using immediately. First, second-order thinking. Don't just ask what's the immediate consequence of this decision, ask what's the consequence of that consequence. Most people think first-order, second-order thinkers win. Second, inversion: instead of asking what should I do to succeed, ask what should I do to fail, then don't do those things. Third, distinguish mental models from reality. Constantly ask, is this my interpretation or is it really like this? How else could it be interpreted? Fourth, consider time horizons. Does this decision optimize for 10 minutes from now, 10 months from now, or 10 years from now? Fifth, practice systems thinking. Which elements are affecting each other here? What are the feedback loops? These 5 models alone, if you internalize and apply them consistently, will transform your decision-making. Think of building your mental model library like constructing a cathedral. Each model is a stone, solid, shaped for its purpose, carefully placed. Over years, you build an impressive structure, a mind that sees clearly, thinks deeply, decides wisely, and acts effectively. This isn't quick or easy. Building a rich library of mental models is a lifelong project. But it's perhaps the most valuable project you can undertake, because everything else in your life depends on the quality of your thinking. Your career success depends on how well you understand systems, people, and strategy. Your relationships depend on how well you understand psychology, communication, and human needs. Your financial well-being depends on how well you understand economics, probability, and compound effects. Your health depends on how well you understand biology, habit formation, and long-term consequences. Your sense of meaning depends on how well you understand philosophy, values, and what truly matters. In the chapters ahead, we'll explore the most powerful mental models across multiple disciplines. You'll learn to think like economists, psychologists, biologists, strategists, and philosophers. Each model will expand your capacity to understand and navigate reality. But remember what George Box said: all models are wrong, but some are useful. No model perfectly captures reality. Every model is a simplification, which means something is always lost. That's why you should never become overly attached to a single model. To a man with a hammer, everything looks like a nail. The solution is multi-model thinking, looking at situations from different angles. This model says one thing, but that model implies something different. The truth is probably somewhere between them. Hold your models lightly, use them as tools not as dogma, and continuously refine them based on feedback from reality. As Socrates said, the unexamined life is not worth living. Mental models are the tools for examining life. Someone equipped with them doesn't just live, they live with consciousness, with clarity, with purpose. And that changes everything. Welcome to this journey. The real adventure begins now. Chapter 2: Foundational Models for Clear Thinking. Now that you understand why mental models matter, let's begin building your library with 4 foundational models that will transform how you approach problems, make decisions, and understand the world. These aren't just useful tools, they're fundamental ways of thinking that cut through complexity and confusion. Master these 4 models and you'll have a powerful foundation for clear thinking in any domain. The first and perhaps most powerful model is first principles thinking. This is the practice of breaking down complicated problems into their most basic, fundamental truths and reasoning up from there. Instead of reasoning by analogy, which is how most people think, you reason from foundational facts. Elon Musk is famous for using this approach, and he explains it beautifully. When he wanted to build SpaceX, everyone told him rockets were too expensive. The conventional wisdom was that space travel costs a certain amount, that's just how it is. But Musk applied first principles thinking. He asked, what is a rocket made of? Aluminum alloys, titanium, copper, carbon fiber. What do those materials cost on the commodity market? He did the math and discovered that the raw materials of a rocket cost only about 2% of the typical rocket price. The rest was manufacturing, assembly, overhead, and profit margins built up through decades of aerospace industry conventions. This insight completely changed his approach. Instead of accepting that rockets are expensive, he asked, how can we rearrange these materials more efficiently? The result was SpaceX, which now builds rockets at a fraction of traditional costs. First principles thinking is incredibly powerful because it allows you to bypass assumptions, conventions, and the way things have always been done. Most of the time, we think by analogy. We look at how things are currently done and make incremental changes. Someone might say this is how our competitors do it, or this is industry standard practice, and we accept it as given. But first principles thinking questions everything. It strips away the accumulated conventions and asks, what do we know to be true at the most fundamental level? Then it builds up from there. Consider how most people think about battery costs. For years, electric vehicles were considered impractical because batteries were too expensive. The conventional wisdom was that batteries cost around $600 per kilowatt hour, making electric cars prohibitively expensive. But Musk applied first principles again. He asked, what are batteries made of? Cobalt, nickel, aluminum, carbon, polymers. What do those materials cost? His analysis showed that the materials cost only about $80 per kilowatt hour. The question then became, how can we source these materials smartly and combine them efficiently? This thinking led to massive innovations in battery production. Let me give you a more everyday example. Imagine you want to get fit but think you can't afford a gym membership. The conventional thought pattern is, getting fit requires a gym, gyms cost money, I don't have enough money, therefore I can't get fit. But first principles thinking breaks this down differently. What is required to get fit? You need to move your body in ways that challenge your muscles and cardiovascular system. Do you need a gym for that? No. You need resistance and movement. Can you create resistance without a gym? Yes, your body weight provides resistance. Can you do cardiovascular work without a gym? Yes, you can run, walk, climb stairs. Suddenly the problem transforms. It's not about affording a gym, it's about applying resistance and movement consistently. The solution becomes obvious. Bodyweight exercises, running outdoors, using stairs, perhaps buying a single set of resistance bands for $20. First principles thinking cut through the false constraint. The key to applying first principles thinking is to constantly ask why until you reach bedrock truth. Why do we do it this way? Because that's how the industry does it. Why does the industry do it this way? Because of regulations established 30 years ago. Why were those regulations established? To solve a problem that existed with old technology. Does that problem still exist with current technology? No. Now you've reached first principles and can build a new solution. This model is especially valuable when facing seemingly impossible problems, when you're entering a new field, when conventional approaches aren't working, or when you want to innovate. But it requires courage because you'll often reach conclusions that contradict conventional wisdom, and people will resist. They'll say, that's not how things work, or you don't understand the industry. But if you've truly reasoned from first principles, you might understand it better than they do. The second foundational model is inversion, which means thinking backward to solve forward. Instead of asking, how do I succeed, you ask, how could I fail? Then you avoid those failure paths. Instead of asking, how do I become happy, you ask, what makes people miserable? Then you avoid those things. This might seem like pessimistic thinking, but it's actually one of the most practical and powerful approaches to problem solving. Charlie Munger, Warren Buffett's longtime partner, is famous for this approach. He constantly says, invert, always invert. When asked how to have a happy marriage, he doesn't list the traits of successful marriages. Instead, he says, be unreliable, don't tell the truth, don't give what you ask for, harbor grudges, don't forgive, always put yourself first. Obviously, do the opposite of these things. This inversion makes the path to success crystal clear. Why does inversion work so well? First, it's often easier to identify what causes failure than what causes success. Success can come from many paths, but failure has common patterns. Second, avoiding stupidity is easier than seeking brilliance. As Munger says, it is remarkable how much long-term advantage people like us have gotten by trying to be consistently not stupid, instead of trying to be very intelligent. Third, the downside is often more knowable than the upside. You can predict what will hurt you more accurately than what will help you. Fourth, fixing the biggest problems often has more impact than optimizing for gains. Let me show you inversion in practice. Suppose you want to build a successful business. The conventional approach is to ask, what makes businesses successful? You might identify things like great products, strong marketing, good customer service, efficient operations. These are all true but somewhat vague. Now invert the question. What kills businesses? Running out of cash. Making products nobody wants. Having costs higher than revenue. Failing to adapt when markets shift. Losing key employees. Making bad deals. Overexpanding too quickly. Legal problems. Dependency on a single customer or supplier. Now you have a clear checklist of things to absolutely avoid. Make sure you have adequate cash reserves or cash flow. Validate market demand before building. Keep costs under control. Watch for market changes. Treat key employees well. Be careful with partnerships and contracts. Grow sustainably. Stay legal and ethical. Don't put all eggs in one basket. Follow this checklist and you've already eliminated most of the common failure paths. Consider another example. You want to have a productive day. The forward-thinking approach asks, what should I do to be productive? Wake up early, exercise, eat healthy, focus on important tasks, minimize distractions, take breaks, maintain energy. These are good but require significant willpower to implement. Now invert, what guarantees an unproductive day? Staying up too late, hitting snooze repeatedly, checking your phone first thing, starting work without a plan, saying yes to every interruption, multitasking, working on easy but unimportant tasks, skipping meals, getting dehydrated, sitting all day without movement. Simply avoiding these things makes productivity almost inevitable. You don't have to be perfect, you just have to avoid being stupid. Inversion is particularly powerful in risk management. Before making an investment, don't just think about how you'll make money. Think about how you could lose money and avoid those scenarios. Before launching a project, don't just plan for success. Identify everything that could go wrong and create safeguards. Before making a major life decision, don't just imagine the best case. Consider the worst case and ensure you can handle it. Some practical ways to use inversion. When solving a problem, ask what would make this problem worse and do the opposite. When setting goals, ask what behaviors would guarantee failure and eliminate them. When evaluating options, ask what could go catastrophically wrong with each option. When building systems, ask where the system could break and reinforce those points. When hiring, don't just look for good traits, eliminate candidates with deal-breaker flaws. When investing, focus first on not losing money, then on making money. The third foundational model is second-order thinking, which means considering not just the immediate consequences of a decision, but the consequences of those consequences. Most people think only in first-order terms, about the direct and obvious effects of their actions. Second-order thinkers go further. They ask, and then what? What happens next? What are the downstream effects? This type of thinking is rare but incredibly valuable because first-order consequences often differ dramatically from second-order consequences. Here's a simple example. First order, eating dessert tastes good and makes me happy right now. Second order, eating dessert regularly leads to weight gain, energy crashes, and health problems. First order, staying up late to finish this project gets it done. Second order. Sleep deprivation tomorrow reduces my productivity, affecting other projects and my well-being. First order, taking on this freelance project brings extra income. Second order, the time spent means less time for my main work, relationships, and rest, potentially harming long-term career growth and health. See the pattern? The immediate effect looks positive, but thinking 2 steps ahead reveals hidden costs. Let's explore a more complex example. A city is experiencing traffic congestion, so officials decide to widen the main highway. First order thinking, more lanes means more capacity means less congestion. Seems logical. They spend millions widening the highway. What happens? Initially, traffic flows better. Success, right? But within a year or two, traffic is just as bad as before, sometimes worse. What happened? Second order effects. When the highway became easier to drive, more people chose to drive instead of taking public transit. Some people who used to take side roads switched to the highway. Some people who used to avoid trips during rush hour now made those trips. Some people who were considering moving closer to work decided they could tolerate a longer commute. The wider highway induced additional demand. This is called induced demand, and it's a well-documented second-order effect. First-order thinking saw only capacity increase. Second-order thinking would have predicted behavioral changes in response to that capacity increase. Consider antibiotics as another example. First order, antibiotics kill bacteria and cure infections. Wonderful medical advancement. Second order, overuse of antibiotics creates selective pressure for resistant bacteria. The bacteria that survive antibiotic treatment are the ones with resistance genes. These multiply, and over time, we get antibiotic-resistant bacteria. Now we have superbugs that our antibiotics can't kill, creating a major public health crisis. The first-order benefit was so obvious that we didn't think carefully about second-order consequences until they became severe. Or think about social media. First order, easy way to stay connected with friends, share updates, see interesting content. Second order. Constant social comparison creates anxiety and depression, algorithms optimize for engagement rather than well-being, echo chambers form and polarize society, attention spans shrink, misinformation spreads rapidly, privacy erodes. The first-order benefits were immediate and obvious, the second-order costs took time to emerge. How do you practice second-order thinking? Start by always asking and then what? After you identify the immediate consequence, push further. If this happens, what will happen next? What will people do in response? What behaviors will change? What new equilibrium will emerge? Consider multiple time horizons. What happens in a week, a month, a year, 5 years? Look for feedback loops. Does the consequence create conditions that amplify or diminish themselves? Think about incentives. How will this change what people are motivated to do? Consider systems effects. How will this ripple through the interconnected system? Look for second-order benefits too, not just costs. Sometimes something that seems bad in the first order is good in the second order. Exercise hurts in the moment but strengthens you over time. Difficult feedback stings immediately but improves performance long-term. Spending money on quality tools costs more now but saves time and frustration later. Let me give you a personal example. Years ago I was offered a job with a significantly higher salary than my current position. First-order thinking, more money equals better opportunity, obvious yes. But I applied second-order thinking. The higher salary came with much longer hours and a toxic boss. Second order, working those hours would damage my health, strain my relationships, leave no time for learning and personal projects. The toxic boss would make work miserable and hurt my confidence. I might make more money, but I'd be less happy, less healthy, and have less time to develop skills that would lead to even better opportunities later. The long-term opportunity cost of accepting was actually higher than the short-term financial gain. I declined the offer, stayed in a role where I could learn and grow, and 2 years later moved to an even better opportunity that wouldn't have been possible if I'd taken the high-paying toxic job. Second-order thinking saved me. The fourth foundational model is Occam's razor, the principle that the simplest explanation is usually the correct one. More precisely, when you have multiple explanations that fit the observed facts, prefer the one with the fewest assumptions. This doesn't mean the simplest explanation is always right, but it should be your starting point. Complexity should require justification. The name comes from William of Occam, a medieval philosopher, though the principle is ancient. Why does Occam's razor work? Because every assumption you make is a potential point of failure. The more assumptions required for an explanation, the more likely it is that one of those assumptions is wrong. Simple explanations are more likely to be correct simply because they have fewer moving parts that can be mistaken. Here's an everyday example. You send a text message to a friend and don't get a reply. You could construct elaborate explanations. They're angry with me, they're deliberately ignoring me, they're talking about me with others, they're planning to end our friendship. Or you could apply Occam's razor, they're busy, they didn't see the message, they saw it but forgot to reply, their phone died. The simpler explanations require fewer assumptions and are far more likely to be true. Yet many people default to the complex explanation, creating stress and relationship problems from nothing. Consider medical diagnosis. A patient comes in with a headache, fatigue, and blurred vision. A doctor could hypothesize rare, exotic diseases that might cause this combination of symptoms. Or they could start with common explanations: dehydration, stress, lack of sleep, eye strain from screen time, or common infections. Medical students learn the aphorism, when you hear hoofbeats, think horses, not zebras. Start with common, simple explanations before considering rare, complex ones. This doesn't mean dismissing serious possibilities, but it means your first hypothesis should be the simplest explanation consistent with the facts. If simple explanations don't fit, then move to more complex ones. Occam's razor is especially valuable in problem solving at work. When a system stops working, people often jump to complex explanations involving multiple interacting failures. But often the cause is simple. Someone changed a configuration, a file got deleted, a service ran out of memory, a cable came loose. Check the simple things first. When a project fails, we might construct elaborate narratives about market timing, competitive dynamics, and organizational politics. Sometimes the simple explanation is, the product wasn't very good, or we didn't market it effectively, or we ran out of money. When relationships sour, we might develop complex theories about psychology and hidden motives. Sometimes it's simple: you weren't compatible, your values differed, or you didn't communicate well. The razor also applies to building systems and solutions. When designing a product, choose the simpler design that achieves the goal. When writing code, choose the simpler implementation. When creating a process, choose the simpler workflow. Simplicity has multiple benefits: easier to understand, easier to maintain, less likely to break, easier to modify, faster to implement. Complexity should be justified by proportional benefit. Sometimes complexity is necessary, but the burden of proof lies with complexity, not simplicity. Let me share a business example. A company was struggling with low employee morale. Management constructed an elaborate theory: the organizational structure was wrong, the office layout wasn't collaborative enough, the mission statement wasn't inspiring, the benefits package wasn't competitive, the culture wasn't innovative enough. They launched expensive initiatives to address all these factors. Meanwhile, exit interviews revealed something simpler: the managers were jerks. They were dismissive, didn't listen, took credit for others' work, and played favorites. The complex explanations were unnecessary. The simple explanation was bad management. Fix the managers, morale improves. Occam's razor would have saved significant time and money. Here's how to apply Occam's razor practically. When facing multiple explanations, list them out explicitly. For each explanation, identify what assumptions it requires. Count the assumptions. Start with the explanation requiring the fewest assumptions. Test it. Only if simple explanations fail should you move to more complex ones. When building solutions, start with the minimal viable approach. Add complexity only when simplicity proves insufficient. When communicating, choose the simplest explanation that conveys the truth. Don't mistake simplicity for incompleteness, though. Occam's razor doesn't say the simplest explanation is always right. It says prefer simpler explanations when they fit the facts equally well. If the simple explanation doesn't account for important evidence, then greater complexity is justified. Albert Einstein captured this beautifully: everything should be made as simple as possible, but not simpler. Simplicity is a virtue, but not at the expense of accuracy. The goal is appropriate simplicity, matching the complexity of your explanation to the complexity of reality. No more, no less. Occam's razor helps you avoid the trap of unnecessary complexity, but judgment is still required to determine what's necessary. Now let's see how these four models work together in real situations. Imagine you're starting a small business selling handmade products online. You're overwhelmed by all the advice. Build a perfect website, create a complex marketing funnel, establish presence on every social platform, develop a comprehensive business plan, incorporate as an LLC, hire contractors, invest in inventory. This is how most people fail before they begin. They make things too complex too fast. Apply first principles thinking. What do you actually need to make money? You need products people want, a way for them to see and buy those products, and a way to deliver products to them. That's it. Everything else is optional. This clarity is liberating. Start with these essentials. Make a few products. Post them on an existing platform like Etsy or Instagram where people already are. When someone buys, make and ship the product. You're in business. You've validated demand with minimal investment. Apply inversion. What would guarantee failure? Making products nobody wants, spending all your money before generating revenue, creating friction that prevents purchases, delivering poor quality, ignoring customers, making it impossible to find you. Avoid these and you're ahead of most. Don't spend 6 months building a perfect website before testing if anyone wants your product. That's a guaranteed way to waste time and money. Apply second-order thinking. If you succeed at selling your first products, what happens next? Demand increases. Can you scale production? If you discount heavily to get initial sales, second-order effect is customers expect low prices permanently. If you overpromise delivery times to win orders, second-order effect is you can't deliver and disappoint customers. Think through these consequences before they become problems. Apply Occam's razor. When something goes wrong, start with simple explanations. Sales dropped this week? Before constructing theories about market shifts or algorithm changes, check simple things. Did you post less content? Is there a holiday? Did shipping costs increase on your site? Did a product link break? The simple explanation is usually right. Together, these models guide you to start simple, test quickly, avoid obvious mistakes, think ahead about consequences, and troubleshoot effectively. This approach succeeds far more often than the common alternative of complex planning followed by paralysis. Let's take another example: improving your health and fitness. The conventional approach leads to complexity, elaborate workout programs, strict meal plans, supplements, tracking every metric, expensive equipment, gym memberships. Most people quit because it's overwhelming. First principles: what does health require? Moving your body regularly, eating mostly whole foods, sleeping adequately, managing stress, avoiding destructive habits. That's the foundation. Start there. Walk daily, eat vegetables and protein, sleep 7 to 8 hours, find ways to relax, don't smoke. These simple actions produce most of the benefit. Inversion: what destroys health? Sitting all day, eating mostly processed food, chronic sleep deprivation, unmanaged chronic stress, smoking, excessive alcohol, ignoring symptoms of serious problems. Avoid these and you've eliminated most health risks. This is easier than trying to optimize every variable. Second-order thinking: if you start an extreme diet, first order is rapid weight loss. Second order is metabolic adaptation, muscle loss, and eventual rebound weight gain. If you overtrain with exercise, first order is initial fitness gains. Second order is injury, burnout, and quitting. If you rely on willpower alone, first order might be success. Second order is willpower depletion and reverting to old habits. Think ahead and choose sustainable approaches. Occam's razor: if you're not seeing results, start with simple explanations. Are you actually following the plan consistently? Are you eating more than you think? Are you moving less than you believe? Usually the explanation is simple execution, not complex biology. These 4 models create a powerful foundation for clear thinking. First principle strips away false constraints and reveals what's actually necessary. Inversion shows you what to avoid, often clearer than what to pursue. Second-order thinking prevents unintended consequences and helps you optimize for long-term rather than short-term. Occam's razor keeps you from overcomplicating and helps you focus on what matters. Master these 4 and you'll think more clearly than 90% of people. You'll waste less time on unnecessary complexity, avoid obvious mistakes, see further into the future, and get to the heart of problems faster. These aren't the only mental models you'll need, but they're foundational. Build on this base and your thinking will become increasingly sophisticated and effective. In the next chapters, we'll add more models to your toolkit, but keep coming back to these 4. They're the bedrock of clear thinking. Chapter 3: Models for Better Decision Making. Every day you make hundreds of decisions, from trivial choices like what to eat for breakfast to significant ones that shape your life's trajectory. The quality of these decisions determines the quality of your life. Yet most people make decisions based on gut feelings, social pressure, or whatever seems right in the moment. Great decision makers think differently. They use mental models that help them navigate uncertainty, evaluate options systematically, and consistently choose paths that lead to better outcomes. In this chapter, we'll explore 4 essential models that will transform how you make decisions. The first and perhaps most important model for decision-making is probabilistic thinking. This is the practice of thinking in terms of likelihood rather than certainty, understanding that most things in life are not black and white but exist on a spectrum of probability. Most people think in binary terms. They ask, will this work or won't it? Is this true or false? Will I succeed or fail? But reality rarely works this way. Very few things are absolutely certain. Instead, outcomes exist on a probability distribution. The question isn't will this happen? But how likely is this to happen? Consider a simple example. You're deciding whether to take an umbrella when leaving home. Most people check if it's raining now. If yes, take umbrella. If no, leave it. This is binary thinking. Probabilistic thinking asks, what's the chance of rain today? If there's a 10% chance and you're only going to be out for 15 minutes, probably not worth carrying an umbrella. If there's a 70% chance and you'll be out for hours, definitely take it. If there's a 40% chance, you might consider the consequences. If you're wearing an expensive suit and have important meetings, the cost of getting wet is high, so even a moderate probability warrants an umbrella. If you're in casual clothes and going somewhere with indoor parking, maybe the inconvenience of carrying an umbrella outweighs the risk. See how probabilistic thinking creates nuance and context sensitivity that binary thinking misses? Let's explore a more significant decision. Imagine you're considering a job offer in a new city. Binary thinking asks, is this the right move or wrong move? This creates paralysis because you can't know for certain. Probabilistic thinking reframes it. What's the probability this will work out well? Then you break it down further. What's the probability I'll like the work itself? Based on similar roles I've had, conversations with people in this position, and my interests, maybe 70%. What's the probability I'll get along with my new manager? I've met them twice, they seem reasonable, I've heard positive things, maybe 65%. What's the probability I'll build a good social life in the new city? I don't know anyone there, but I've successfully made friends in new places before. The city has activities I enjoy, maybe 55%. What's the probability the company will be stable and growing? Their financials are solid, the industry is healthy, but there's always uncertainty, maybe 70%. Now multiply these probabilities to get a rough overall probability of success. Or, more usefully, identify which probabilities you're most uncertain about and gather more information to refine your estimates. The key insight is that you're not trying to achieve certainty, which is impossible. You're trying to make the best decision under uncertainty, and understanding probabilities helps you do that. Probabilistic thinking also helps you avoid extreme overconfidence and extreme pessimism. Overconfident people assign high probabilities to their preferred outcomes without evidence. They think I'm sure this will work when they should think there's maybe a 40% chance this works, so what's my plan if it doesn't? Pessimistic people assign low probabilities to positive outcomes without justification. They think this will never work when they should think there's a reasonable chance this works if I execute well. Professional poker players are masters of probabilistic thinking. They never know what cards their opponents hold, yet they must make decisions worth thousands of dollars. How? They think in probabilities. Based on betting patterns, position, and known information, they estimate the probability their opponent has a strong hand versus a weak hand. They calculate the probability they'll improve their own hand on the next card. They compute whether the potential reward justifies the risk given these probabilities. They don't need certainty. They just need to make decisions that are profitable over many iterations. This is exactly how you should think about life decisions. Weather forecasters also exemplify this thinking. When a meteorologist says there's a 40% chance of rain, they're not being wishy-washy. They're communicating honest uncertainty. They're saying, given current atmospheric conditions, similar patterns in the past led to rain 40% of the time. This is valuable information. It tells you to prepare for both scenarios. Many people misunderstand this and get frustrated when it doesn't rain. They said it would rain and it didn't. No, they said there was a 40% chance. 60% of the time it won't rain. That's exactly what the forecast meant. How do you practice probabilistic thinking? Start by catching yourself when you think in certainties. When you find yourself thinking this will definitely work or that's impossible, pause and reframe. What's the actual probability? Even rough estimates are better than false certainty. Use calibration language. Very unlikely means maybe 5 to 10%, unlikely means 20 to 30%, toss-up means around 50%, likely means 60 to 70%, very likely means 80 to 90%, near certain means 95% or higher. Get in the habit of quantifying your beliefs, even roughly. Over time, you'll become more calibrated, meaning your probability estimates will match reality better. If you say something is 70% likely and you're well calibrated, it should happen about 7 times out of 10. The second essential model is expected value reasoning. This builds directly on probabilistic thinking. Expected value means the average outcome you'd expect if you could repeat a decision many times. You calculate it by multiplying each possible outcome by its probability and summing the results. This sounds abstract, so let's make it concrete. Suppose someone offers you a bet. You pay $10. They flip a coin. Heads, you win $25. Tails, you get nothing. Should you take this bet? Expected value reasoning gives you the answer. There's a 50% chance you win $25 and a 50% chance you win 0. Expected value equals 50% times $25 plus 50% times 0, which equals $12.50. But you paid $10, so your expected profit is $2.50. This is a good bet. You should take it every time it's offered. Now imagine a different bet. Pay $10, flip a coin. Heads you win $15, tails you get nothing. Expected value is 50% times $15, which equals $7.50. You paid $10, so your expected value is negative $2.50. This is a bad bet. You should never take it. Over many repetitions, you'd lose money. This is simple when dealing with coins and known probabilities, but the same principle applies to all decisions. Every choice has possible outcomes, each with some probability. The rational choice is the one with the highest expected value. Let's apply this to a real decision. You're offered a job at a stable company for $80,000 per year, or a job at a startup for $70,000 plus equity that might be worthless or might be worth a lot. How do you decide? Expected value reasoning helps. The stable job has near certain value, call it 95% probability of keeping the job and salary for at least a few years. Expected value is roughly $80,000 times 95% equals $76,000 per year. The startup has the $70,000 salary plus uncertain equity value. You need to estimate the probability distribution of equity outcomes. Maybe there's a 60% chance the startup fails and the equity is worthless. Maybe 30% chance it does okay and your equity is worth $50,000 eventually. Maybe 9% chance it does well and your equity is worth $200,000 eventually. And 1% chance it becomes huge and your equity is worth $2 million. Expected value of equity is 60% times 0 plus 30% times 50,000 plus 9% times 200,000 plus 1% times 2 million equals 0 plus 15,000 plus 18,000 plus 20,000 equals $53,000. Add the $70,000 salary and your total expected value is $123,000. That's higher than the stable job. But this calculation depends heavily on your probability estimates. If you think there's actually an 80% chance of failure, the math changes dramatically. This is where expected value reasoning becomes an art as much as a science. You're making educated guesses about probabilities and outcomes. But even rough estimates are better than ignoring expected value entirely. Many people take the certain 80,000 over the uncertain startup opportunity because certainty feels safer, even when the expected value of the uncertain option is higher. This is called risk aversion, and while some risk aversion is rational, too much means you miss valuable opportunities. Here's another powerful application. Imagine you're trying to grow your business and considering two marketing strategies. Strategy A costs $5,000 and, based on your research, has a 70% chance of bringing in $20,000 in new revenue and a 30% chance of bringing in only $2,000. Expected value is 70% times 20,000 plus 30% times 2,000 equals 14,000 plus 600 equals $14,600 in revenue, minus the 5,000 cost, equals 9,600 in expected profit. Strategy B costs only $1,000 but has a 40% chance of bringing $15,000 and a 60% chance of bringing just $1,000. Expected value is 40% times 15,000 plus 60% times 1,000 equals 6,000 plus 600 equals 6,600 in revenue, minus 1,000 cost, equals 5,600 in expected profit. Even though Strategy B is cheaper and has a decent chance of working, Strategy A has higher expected value. If you can afford the higher upfront cost, Strategy A is the better choice. Expected value reasoning also helps with decisions about insurance, education, career moves, and investments. Should you buy travel insurance for a trip? Calculate the probability something goes wrong times the cost if it does, compare to the insurance premium. Should you get an advanced degree? Estimate the probability it leads to higher earnings, multiply by the expected increase in lifetime earnings, compare to the cost of the degree plus opportunity cost of years not working. Should you invest in stocks versus bonds? Estimate the expected return of each given historical data and current conditions, adjusted for risk. None of these calculations will be perfectly accurate, but they force you to think clearly about trade-offs rather than making decisions based on fear or blind optimism. The important thing to understand about expected value is that it's about making good decisions, not guaranteeing good outcomes. You can make a decision with positive expected value and still get an unlucky result. If you take that coin flip bet with positive expected value, you'll still lose half the time. That doesn't mean the decision was wrong. Over many similar decisions, expected value thinking wins. This is hard for people to accept emotionally. We judge decisions by their outcomes, but we should judge them by the quality of thinking that went into them given the information available at the time. The third model is the map is not the territory, which reminds us that the models we use to understand reality are not reality itself, they are simplified representations. A map of a city shows streets and landmarks but omits millions of details: the texture of sidewalks, the smell of restaurants, the personalities of residents, the feeling of walking through different neighborhoods. The map is useful precisely because it omits details, focusing on what's relevant for navigation. But if you confuse the map for the territory, you'll be surprised when reality doesn't match your model. This principle applies to all mental models, including the ones in this book. When you think probabilistically, you're creating a map of uncertainty. When you calculate expected value, you're creating a map of potential outcomes. These maps are useful but incomplete. Reality is always more complex, more nuanced, more surprising than any model can capture. The danger comes when you forget this and treat your model as truth rather than as a useful approximation. Consider economic models. Economists build mathematical models of how markets work, how people make choices, how economies grow. These models are useful for understanding general principles and making predictions. But they simplify reality dramatically. They might assume people are perfectly rational, information is freely available, markets are perfectly competitive. None of these assumptions are exactly true. Real people are influenced by emotions, biases, and social pressure. Information is costly to acquire and often ambiguous. Markets have friction, monopolies, and regulations. So when economic models make predictions that don't match reality, the problem isn't that economics is useless, it's that the map is not the territory. The model is still useful, but you need to remember its limitations and adjust for factors it doesn't capture. Think about how we use language. Words are maps of concepts and experiences. When I say love, you understand something, but your understanding based on your experiences might be quite different from what I mean based on mine. The word is a map pointing at a territory of emotion and connection, but the map is imperfect. This is why communication is hard. We're sharing maps and assuming they represent the same territory, but often they don't. Misunderstandings happen when we forget this and assume our map is the only valid representation. In business, strategic plans are maps. A company creates a 5-year plan with projections, milestones, and initiatives. This plan is not reality, it's a map of hoped for reality. Markets will shift, competitors will act unexpectedly, technology will evolve, regulations will change, key employees will leave. The map will not match the territory. Wise leaders know this. They hold the plan lightly, update it as new information arrives, and maintain flexibility. Unwise leaders treat the plan as sacred truth and get angry when reality doesn't conform. They're confusing map and territory. Scientific theories are maps. Newton's physics was an excellent map of physical reality. It predicted planetary motion, explained falling objects, enabled engineering marvels. Then Einstein showed that Newton's map was incomplete. At very high speeds and very strong gravitational fields, Newton's equations don't match territory. Einstein's relativity is a better map. But even Einstein's map isn't perfect. It's incompatible with quantum mechanics. Physicists are still trying to create a unified map that captures all aspects of reality. Will they succeed? Maybe, but that map too will be a simplification, useful but not identical to territory itself. How do you apply this model practically? First, hold all beliefs and models provisionally. Even things you're very confident about could be wrong or incomplete. Be willing to update your maps when you encounter territory that doesn't fit. Second, actively seek disconfirming evidence. If your map says X, look for situations where X doesn't hold. Those exceptions are telling you about the limits of your map. Third, use multiple maps. Different models highlight different aspects of reality. Seeing a situation through multiple frameworks gives you a more complete picture than any single map. Fourth, pay attention to your surprise. When reality surprises you, it's usually because your map was incomplete or inaccurate. Instead of dismissing the surprise or forcing reality into your map, update your map. Fifth, communicate with epistemic humility. Instead of saying "this is how it is," say "this is how I understand it" or "based on this model." This keeps you and others aware that you're working with maps, not territory. Let me give you a personal example. I used to have a map that said if I work hard and deliver results, I'll be recognized and promoted. This seemed obviously true and matched my early career experience. Then I worked for a manager who promoted based on politics and favoritism rather than merit. My map didn't match the territory. I was confused and frustrated. Why wasn't my map working? Eventually I realized my map was incomplete. It worked in some organizational cultures but not others. I needed a better map that accounted for different leadership styles and organizational dynamics. The lesson wasn't that hard work doesn't matter. It was that hard work equals recognition is an oversimplified map. The territory is more complex, involving factors like visibility, relationships, organizational culture, timing, and yes, sometimes luck. The fourth essential model for decision-making is circle of competence, a concept popularized by Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger. The idea is simple but profound: know what you don't know, and stay within areas where you have genuine expertise. Your circle of competence includes the domains where you have deep knowledge, extensive experience, and good judgment. Outside your circle, you're guessing, no better than anyone else, maybe worse if you don't realize your limitations. Great decision makers are ruthlessly honest about the boundaries of their competence. Warren Buffett illustrates this beautifully. He's one of the greatest investors of all time, yet he freely admits there are entire industries he doesn't understand and won't invest in. For years, he avoided technology companies, saying he didn't understand how to evaluate their competitive advantages and long-term prospects. Many people criticized this, saying he was missing huge opportunities during the dot-com boom. And it's true, he missed some winners. But he also avoided the dot-com crash that destroyed many investors who thought they understood tech but actually didn't. Buffett stayed in his circle of competence: insurance, consumer goods, financial services, businesses with simple, predictable economics. He understood these deeply. Within his circle, his track record is extraordinary. Outside it, he's wise enough not to pretend expertise he doesn't have. The challenge is that most people don't know the boundaries of their competence. They think their circle is larger than it is. This is called the Dunning-Kruger effect. People with limited knowledge in a domain often overestimate their competence because they don't know enough to realize what they don't know. As you gain real expertise, you become more aware of complexity and uncertainty, so paradoxically you become less confident even as you become more competent. Experts know how much they don't know. Novices think they know more than they do. Consider something you're genuinely expert at. Maybe it's your profession, maybe it's a hobby you've pursued for years. Think about how much nuance you perceive that others miss. You see patterns, anticipate problems, make distinctions that seem obvious to you but invisible to outsiders. That's what being inside a circle of competence feels like. Now think about domains where you're a novice. You might read a few articles and think you understand, but you're missing all that nuance. You don't know what you don't know. This is being outside your circle. Here's the critical insight: being outside your circle isn't bad if you know it. The mistake is thinking you're inside when you're outside, making confident decisions without adequate knowledge. So how do you determine your circles of competence? Ask yourself, do I have extensive direct experience in this area? Have I made many decisions here and seen the results? Do I understand the underlying principles, not just surface patterns? Can I explain why things work the way they do? Do I know what factors matter and what don't? Can I predict what will happen better than average? If the answer to these questions is no, you're outside your circle. Let me give you examples of being inside versus outside circles. I've been writing for 20 years. I'm inside my circle of competence for writing. I can read a sentence and immediately see how to improve it. I can structure an argument effectively. I can predict what will resonate with readers. I've made thousands of writing decisions and seen the results. This is genuine expertise. But I'm completely outside my circle regarding automotive mechanics. I can change a tire, check oil, that's it. If my car makes a strange noise, I have no idea what it means. I couldn't tell you if a repair quote is fair or if the problem is serious. I'm a complete novice. Knowing this, I don't make my own decisions about car repairs. I find a mechanic I trust and rely on their expertise. I've transferred the decision-making to someone inside their circle of competence. The same person can be inside their circle in one context and outside it in another. A software engineer might be expert at building applications but know nothing about managing people. They're inside their circle for technical decisions, outside for personnel decisions. If promoted to management, they need to either expand their circle through learning and experience, or surround themselves with people whose circles cover what theirs don't. Many smart people fail when they're promoted beyond their circle of competence and don't realize it. How do you expand your circle of competence? Slowly and deliberately. You can't just read a few books and claim expertise. You need direct experience, feedback loops, pattern recognition built over time, lessons learned from mistakes. You need to test your understanding against reality repeatedly. If you want to develop competence in investing, you don't just read about it. You start small, make actual investments, observe what happens, learn from mistakes, gradually build pattern recognition. Over years, maybe decades, your circle expands. But it expands gradually, not instantly. Here's how great decision makers use circle of competence practically. First, they map their circles honestly. They identify areas of genuine expertise and areas where they're average or below. Second, for important decisions within their circles, they trust their judgment. They've earned that confidence through experience. Third, for decisions outside their circles, they either bring in experts, or they decline to act, or they approach with extreme humility and caution. Fourth, they're very careful about expanding claims of competence. Just because you're expert in one area doesn't mean related areas are within your circle. Fifth, they create systems that keep them honest. Buffett has a rule: he has to be able to explain why an investment will work in simple terms. If he can't, it's probably outside his circle and he passes. Let me show you how these four models work together in making a real decision. Imagine you're considering whether to start a side business while keeping your full-time job. This is a significant decision with real consequences for your time, money, and career. How do great decision makers approach this? First, use probabilistic thinking. Don't ask, will this succeed or fail? Ask, what's the probability of different outcomes? Maybe there's a 20% chance the business takes off and becomes your full-time income within 2 years. Maybe 30% chance it becomes a nice supplementary income stream. Maybe 40% chance it barely breaks even after accounting for your time. Maybe 10% chance it fails completely and you lose your investment. These probabilities depend on the business model, market, your skills, and effort level. Second, apply expected value reasoning. Estimate the financial value of each outcome. If it becomes your full-time income, maybe that's worth an extra $50,000 per year. If it's supplementary income, maybe $10,000 per year. If it breaks even, zero value financially, but maybe you learned valuable skills. If it fails completely, maybe you lost $5,000 and a lot of time. Calculate expected value. 20% times 50,000 plus 30% times 10,000 plus 40% times 0 minus 10% times 5,000 equals 10,000 plus 3,000 minus 500 equals 12,500 in expected value. That suggests positive expected value, but you also need to factor in non-financial costs like stress, time away from family, and impact on your primary job performance. If those costs are high, they might outweigh financial expected value. Third, remember the map is not the territory. Your probability estimates and value calculations are models, not truth. Reality will be messy. You might have overestimated your chances because you're optimistic. The market might shift in ways you didn't anticipate. Your energy level might be lower than you think. Hold your projections lightly. Build in safety margins. Plan for scenarios where your map is wrong. Don't bet everything on your model being accurate. Fourth, apply circle of competence. Is this business in an area where you have genuine expertise? If you're a graphic designer starting a design side business, you're inside your circle for the core service. But are you inside your circle for marketing, sales, customer service, bookkeeping, legal compliance? Probably not. So either learn those areas, partner with people who have those competencies, or keep the business simple enough that gaps in your competence won't sink it. If the business is in a completely different field from your expertise, you're outside your circle. You'd need to either build competence first through lower stakes learning, or question whether this is the right opportunity. By applying all four models, you make a much better decision than gut instinct alone would give you. You think about likelihood rather than certainty. You evaluate expected outcomes systematically. You remain humble about your models. You're honest about your limitations. This is how great decision makers think. Not perfectly, not with certainty, but systematically and rationally. Over time, over many decisions, this approach leads to much better outcomes. These four models form the core of excellent decision-making. Master them and you'll make fewer mistakes, seize better opportunities, waste less time on bad options, and feel more confident in your choices. You won't always be right, nobody is. But you'll be right more often, and when you're wrong, you'll recognize it faster and adjust. That's all anyone can ask. In the next chapter, we'll explore models for understanding people and systems, but keep returning to these decision-making fundamentals. They're tools you'll use every single day. Chapter 4: Psychological and Behavioral Mental Models. Your brain is the most sophisticated organ in the known universe, capable of extraordinary reasoning, creativity, and insight. Yet this same brain is riddled with systematic errors, predictable distortions, and built-in shortcuts that often lead you astray. Understanding these psychological patterns is essential for clear thinking because you cannot overcome biases you don't know exist. In this chapter, we'll explore the most important psychological and behavioral models that will help you recognize when your mind is playing tricks on you and how to think more rationally despite these built-in limitations. The fundamental insight to grasp is that cognitive biases are not character flaws or signs of stupidity. They are features of how human cognition evolved. Our brains developed in an environment very different from the modern world. For most of human history, we lived in small tribes, faced immediate physical threats, had limited information, and needed to make quick decisions with incomplete data. Our cognitive shortcuts evolved because they helped our ancestors survive. The problem is that these same shortcuts, which were adaptive in the ancestral environment, often mislead us in the modern world where information is abundant, threats are abstract, and decisions have complex long-term consequences. Understanding this context helps you be more compassionate with yourself when you catch biases in your thinking, while also being vigilant about correcting them. Let's start with one of the most powerful and pervasive biases: loss aversion. This is the tendency to feel the pain of losing something more intensely than the pleasure of gaining something of equal value. Research by Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky demonstrated that losses feel roughly twice as painful as equivalent gains feel good. If you lose $50, the negative emotion you experience is about twice as strong as the positive emotion from finding $50. This isn't rational in a strict sense, but it made evolutionary sense. In a survival context, losing a day's food could mean death, while gaining an extra day's food just meant some surplus. The asymmetry was adaptive. But in modern contexts, loss aversion often leads to poor decisions. Consider how loss aversion affects investing. Imagine you bought stock for $100 per share and it drops to $80. Rationally, you should evaluate whether the stock at $80 is a good investment going forward. If the company's fundamentals are weak and prospects are poor, you should sell even at a loss. If fundamentals are strong, you should hold or even buy more. Your purchase price is irrelevant to the investment decision today. But loss aversion makes selling at a loss feel terrible. It forces you to realize the loss, to admit you were wrong. So many investors hold losing positions far too long, hoping to get back to even when the rational choice is to cut losses and redeploy capital elsewhere. Meanwhile, they're quick to sell winning positions because gains feel good and they want to lock them in, even when the rational choice might be to let winners run. This tendency, selling winners too early and holding losers too long, is the opposite of good investing strategy, and it's driven by loss aversion. Loss aversion also affects career decisions. Imagine you're in a job that's mediocre. It's not terrible, but you're not learning, not growing, not excited. A better opportunity comes along, but it involves risk. Maybe it's at a startup that might fail, or a new industry where you'd be starting over. The potential gain from the new opportunity might be significant, but loss aversion makes you focus on what you'd lose. The stability of your current job, the relationships you've built, the comfort of knowing your role. The fear of loss looms larger than the promise of gain, so you stay in the mediocre situation. Years pass and you realize you've lost something much more valuable than job security. You've lost time, growth, and opportunity. Loss aversion protected you from a short-term loss but caused a much larger long-term loss. How do you counter loss aversion? First, recognize it when you feel it. That intense resistance to taking a loss, that voice saying just wait a little longer when you're holding a bad position, that's loss aversion talking. Second, reframe decisions by focusing on going forward value rather than sunk costs. Ask yourself, if I didn't already own this stock or have this job or be in this relationship, would I choose it today? If no, then the fact that you already have it shouldn't change your decision. Third, practice taking small losses deliberately. This desensitizes you to the pain. When you catch yourself making a small mistake, acknowledge it quickly, cut the loss, and move on. This builds the psychological muscle to handle larger losses when necessary. Fourth, shift your reference point from what you have to what you could have. Instead of thinking I'll lose X if I quit, think I'll gain Y if I pursue this opportunity. Same decision, different framing, and framing matters. The second major bias is anchoring, the tendency to rely too heavily on the first piece of information you encounter when making decisions. Once an anchor is set, your subsequent judgments are pulled toward it, even when the anchor is completely arbitrary and irrelevant. In one famous study, researchers asked people to write down the last 2 digits of their social security number, then asked them to estimate the value of various items like wine or chocolate. People whose social security numbers ended in high digits gave significantly higher value estimates than people whose numbers ended in low digits. A completely random number influenced their valuations. This seems absurd, but it demonstrates how powerfully anchoring works, often without our awareness. Anchoring shows up everywhere in daily life. When you're negotiating to buy a car, the sticker price is an anchor. Even if you know cars are negotiable, that initial number influences your perception of what's reasonable. If the sticker says $40,000, you might feel good negotiating down to $36,000. But if the sticker said $35,000, you'd probably settle around $31,000 for the same car. The seller knows this, which is why they set high initial prices. In salary negotiations, whoever names a number first sets the anchor. If you're interviewing and they ask your salary expectations, you want to anchor high but reasonable. If you say $90,000, the negotiation will center around that number. If you say $70,000, you've anchored lower and will likely get less, even if they were willing to pay $90,000. Conversely, if the employer names a number first, say $80,000, that becomes the anchor for you. You might have asked for $100,000 if you'd gone first, but now $80,000 feels like the baseline. Anchoring affects how you perceive deals and value. Retailers exploit this constantly. A jacket with a crossed-out price of $200 and a sale price of $100 feels like a great deal. You're anchored to $200, so $100 seems like 50% off. But maybe the jacket was never actually sold for $200. Maybe it's only worth $80 at other stores. The anchor manipulated your perception of value. The same technique works in restaurants with wine lists. They put extremely expensive wines at the top, say $300 a bottle. These rarely sell, but they anchor your expectations upward. Suddenly the $70 bottle seems reasonable by comparison, even though you might normally buy $20 wine. The expensive options exist primarily as anchors. Anchoring also influences how you interpret information. If I tell you a fact and provide a number first, that number becomes your anchor. Some experts estimate unemployment could rise as high as 15% in the next recession. Now 15% is in your mind as a possibility. When actual predictions come in at 6 or 7%, it feels moderate by comparison. But if I'd started with unemployment might tick up to 5 or 6%, your expectations would be anchored much lower. Politicians and media understand this, which is why they carefully choose which numbers to mention first when framing issues. How do you defend against anchoring? First, be aware when anchors are being set. In any negotiation, purchasing decision, or situation involving numbers, notice the first number mentioned and recognize it as a potential anchor. Second, deliberately set counter anchors. If a seller opens with a high price, immediately respond with a low but justifiable counteroffer. This sets your own anchor and the true negotiation happens between the two. Third, gather information independently before encountering anchors. If you're buying a car, research fair prices from multiple sources before visiting dealers. This gives you your own internal anchor based on data rather than accepting the dealer's anchor. Fourth, make absolute judgments rather than relative ones. Don't ask, is this a good deal relative to the listed price? Ask, is this a good product at this absolute price, regardless of what else I've seen? Fifth, be especially cautious of arbitrary numbers. If a number seems to appear from nowhere or doesn't have a clear logical basis, it might be an anchor designed to manipulate you. The third critical bias is confirmation bias, which is the tendency to search for, interpret, and remember information in a way that confirms your pre-existing beliefs. Once you believe something, you unconsciously filter information to support that belief and ignore information that contradicts it. This is perhaps the most dangerous bias because it prevents learning and creates echo chambers where false beliefs persist despite contrary evidence. Confirmation bias explains why people with access to the same information can reach completely opposite conclusions. They're filtering the information differently based on what they already believe. Imagine you believe a particular diet is healthy. You'll notice and remember news articles, studies, and testimonials supporting that diet. When you encounter information questioning it, you'll unconsciously discount it, finding reasons why it doesn't apply or why the source is incredible. Meanwhile, someone who believes the diet is unhealthy does the exact opposite with the same information. They notice and remember the critical information and discount the supportive information. Neither person is being deliberately dishonest. Both believe they're evaluating evidence objectively. But confirmation bias is operating beneath conscious awareness, shaping what they notice, how they interpret it, and what they remember. Confirmation bias is especially powerful in politics and contentious social issues. If you lean politically left, you'll find evidence everywhere that left-wing policies work and right-wing policies fail. You'll notice when left-leaning sources make good points and when right-leaning sources are hypocritical or wrong. If you lean politically right, you'll find the exact opposite in the same information landscape. This isn't because one side is right and the other is delusional. It's because everyone is subject to confirmation bias. We all filter reality through our beliefs. The result is polarization. People on different sides aren't just disagreeing about conclusions, they're perceiving completely different realities because they're selecting different information from the same environment. Confirmation bias also affects decision-making in subtle ways. Suppose you're considering whether to accept a job offer. If you're leaning toward accepting, you'll focus on the positive aspects, the salary increase, the interesting work, the growth opportunity. You'll downplay the negatives. The longer commute, the uncertain company culture, the demanding boss. If you're leaning toward declining, you'll do the opposite. You'll fixate on the negatives and dismiss the positives. You think you're weighing pros and cons objectively, but confirmation bias is secretly putting its thumb on the scale. In business, confirmation bias leads to bad strategies persisting long after they should be abandoned. A CEO believes their strategy is working. They'll interpret ambiguous data as confirming success. Sales are up this quarter? See, the strategy works. Sales are down? That's just a temporary blip, the strategy is still sound. They'll seek information from people who agree with them and avoid people who dissent. By the time the failure becomes undeniable, years have been wasted and competitors have pulled ahead. This happens not because the CEO is incompetent, but because confirmation bias is incredibly powerful and operates automatically. How do you fight confirmation bias? This is genuinely difficult because by definition, you can't easily see your own biases. But there are strategies. First, actively seek disconfirming evidence. If you believe X, deliberately look for evidence that X is false. Read sources that disagree with you. Talk to people who hold opposite views. Force yourself to articulate the best case against your position. Second, use the scientific method in your thinking. State your belief as a hypothesis, then ask what evidence would prove it wrong. Then actively look for that evidence. If you can't find any, either your belief is in a domain where evidence doesn't exist, which should make you less confident, or you're not looking hard enough. Third, separate your identity from your beliefs. The more a belief is tied to your sense of self, the more confirmation bias will protect it. Practice holding beliefs lightly, being willing to update them when evidence changes. Fourth, create accountability structures. Tell others your prediction or belief and ask them to point out when you're cherry-picking evidence. Fifth, keep a decision journal. Write down your reasoning when making decisions, then revisit later to see if your predicted reasoning matched what actually happened. This creates a feedback loop that helps you spot patterns of bias. Now let's shift from individual biases to a broader model, systems thinking. This is the practice of understanding how elements within a system interact with each other over time, creating feedback loops and emergent properties that aren't obvious when examining components in isolation. Most people think in straight lines, A causes B. But reality is usually circular. A influences B, which influences C, which influences A, creating feedback loops. Systems thinking helps you see these patterns. A simple example is the thermostat in your house. The temperature drops, the thermostat detects this, the heater turns on, the temperature rises, the thermostat detects this, the heater turns off. This is a negative feedback loop, meaning the system self-corrects to maintain equilibrium. Negative feedback loops are stabilizing. They keep systems within bounds. Your body is full of them. When blood sugar rises, insulin is released to lower it. When blood sugar drops, glucagon is released to raise it. These feedback loops maintain homeostasis. Positive feedback loops work differently. They amplify change rather than dampening it. Imagine a microphone too close to a speaker. A small sound from the speaker enters the microphone, gets amplified, comes out the speaker louder, enters the microphone again, gets amplified further, and quickly you have a deafening screech. That's a positive feedback loop. Small initial differences get amplified over time. Positive feedback loops are destabilizing, but they also drive growth and change. Many phenomena you care about involve feedback loops. Consider your reputation. If you're known as reliable, people give you more important opportunities. Succeeding at these opportunities further enhances your reputation, leading to even better opportunities. This is a positive feedback loop that amplifies success. But it works in reverse too. If you're seen as unreliable, people give you fewer opportunities or less important ones. This makes it harder to demonstrate capability, further cementing the negative reputation. Understanding this feedback loop explains why early career moves and first impressions matter so much. You're not just making one decision, you're potentially starting a feedback loop that amplifies over time. Social media platforms are built on feedback loops. Good content gets engagement, which makes the algorithm show it to more people, leading to more engagement, creating viral growth. This is a positive feedback loop. But it also means controversial or emotional content spreads faster than nuanced or accurate content, because controversy generates engagement. Understanding this feedback loop helps explain why social media often amplifies extreme views and why trying to correct misinformation on these platforms is so difficult. You're fighting against the platform's fundamental feedback structure. Systems thinking also reveals unintended consequences. When you intervene in a system without understanding its feedback loops, you often make things worse. Classic example: rabbits were introduced to Australia in the 1850s for hunting. Without natural predators, their population exploded via positive feedback, becoming an invasive species that caused massive ecological and agricultural damage. The intervention ignored the system dynamics. Another example: antibiotics kill bacteria, solving immediate infections. But overuse creates selective pressure for resistant bacteria, which multiply because susceptible bacteria are eliminated. Now we face antibiotic-resistant superbugs. The short-term solution created a long-term system problem. In organizations, you see this constantly. A company experiences customer service issues, so they implement strict rules about how service reps must handle calls, including required scripts and time limits. This is a linear solution to a perceived problem. But systems thinking reveals the feedback loop. Strict rules reduce rep autonomy and judgment, making service more robotic and less able to handle unique situations. Customer satisfaction drops. More complaints come in. Management responds with even stricter rules. The problem gets worse. The intervention didn't account for feedback loops between autonomy, judgment, and service quality. How do you apply systems thinking? First, map out the key elements in a situation and how they influence each other. Draw diagrams with arrows showing relationships. This makes feedback loops visible. Second, identify whether loops are positive or negative, amplifying or stabilizing. This helps predict system behavior over time. Third, look for delays in feedback loops. Often there's a lag between action and consequence, which makes cause and effect hard to see and leads people to overcorrect. The thermostat works well because feedback is immediate. Economic policy is hard because effects take months or years to manifest, by which time other factors have changed. Fourth, consider leverage points. In any system, some interventions have outsized effects because they interrupt key feedback loops. Find these leverage points rather than pushing harder on ineffective interventions. Fifth, watch for shifting goals. In many systems, the goal shifts in response to performance. A company sets a sales target. Sales team hits it. Next year the target is raised. This creates a feedback loop where success leads to harder goals, which can eventually become demotivating. Let me give you a practical example of using these models together. Imagine you're managing a team and you notice motivation seems low. People are doing the minimum, not showing initiative, missing deadlines. How do you respond? Without psychological models, you might jump to simple conclusions. They're lazy or they don't care. You might implement stricter monitoring and consequences for missing deadlines. But let's apply what we've learned. First, check for confirmation bias. Are you noticing only evidence of low motivation because that's your current belief? Are there counterexamples you're ignoring? Maybe some people are motivated, or maybe motivation varies by project type. Look for disconfirming evidence before proceeding. Second, consider loss aversion in your team members. If they've been burned by past initiatives that failed or weren't rewarded, they might be avoiding new efforts because the potential loss of time and energy feels larger than potential gains from success. They're protecting themselves from loss. Your solution isn't stricter rules, it's reducing the penalty for trying and failing while increasing the visible rewards for initiative. Third, watch for anchoring effects. If you started by saying, "I need everyone working 10% harder," you've anchored expectations. But maybe the issue isn't effort level, maybe it's direction or clarity. By anchoring on effort, you've framed the conversation incorrectly and people will respond to that frame. Fourth, apply systems thinking. What feedback loops exist? Perhaps unclear goals lead to scattered effort leads to poor results lead to micromanagement reduces autonomy, reduced autonomy kills motivation, which leads to more scattered effort. You're in a negative spiral, a vicious feedback loop. Breaking it requires interrupting the loop at a leverage point. Maybe that's providing clearer goals, or reducing micromanagement and trusting people more, or celebrating small wins to shift the feedback toward a positive cycle. By combining psychological awareness with systems thinking, you craft better interventions. You recognize biases in your own perception, you understand the psychological factors affecting your team, and you see the feedback loops maintaining the problem. Your solution is systemic rather than superficial. You might create more clarity around goals, explicitly celebrate initiative even when results aren't perfect, reduce monitoring while increasing support, and actively work to shift the feedback loop from vicious to virtuous. This is more likely to work than the naive response of cracking down harder. Here's another example: personal productivity and habits. You want to exercise regularly but keep failing. Without these models, you might blame willpower or discipline. But let's think systematically. First, loss aversion might be working against you. Going to the gym requires losing time, energy, and comfort in the moment. The gain, better health and fitness, is abstract and distant. The loss is immediate and concrete. To counter this, you need to flip the framing. Make not exercising feel like a loss. Track your streak, so missing a day means losing the streak. Find an exercise buddy, so skipping means losing social connection. Make the loss immediate. Second, use systems thinking to identify feedback loops. Right now you're in a negative loop, you feel out of shape, so exercise is hard and unpleasant, so you avoid it, so you get more out of shape, making exercise even harder. You need to interrupt this loop. Start with exercise so easy it's almost trivial. 5 minutes, or even just putting on workout clothes. This creates small wins, which make exercise feel less daunting, which makes you more likely to do it again, which creates more wins. You're trying to establish a positive feedback loop where success breeds more success. Third, watch out for confirmation bias about your own capabilities. If you believe I'm just not an exercise person, you'll interpret every missed workout as confirming this identity and every successful workout as an exception. Challenge this belief. Look for disconfirming evidence. Remember times you did sustain physical activity. Reframe your identity as someone who's building an exercise habit, not someone who doesn't exercise. The key insight is that you're not operating in isolation. You're a psychological being with built-in biases, operating in systems with feedback loops. Understanding both the psychology and the systems gives you much more leverage to create change. You stop fighting yourself with willpower alone and start designing your environment and mental framing to work with your psychology rather than against it. Let me offer some final thoughts on staying emotionally intelligent and rational despite these psychological challenges. First, recognize that emotional intelligence doesn't mean suppressing emotion or being coldly rational. It means understanding your emotions, recognizing how they influence your thinking, and choosing when to follow them and when to override them. Sometimes your emotions carry wisdom your conscious mind hasn't yet articulated. A feeling of unease about a situation might be picking up on subtle cues you haven't consciously noticed. Other times, emotions like fear, anger, or attachment are triggering biases that lead you away from good decisions. The art is discerning the difference. Second, build in cooling off periods for important decisions. When you notice strong emotion around a decision, that's a red flag that bias might be operating. Don't decide in that moment. Sleep on it. Discuss it with someone detached from the situation. Write out your reasoning and examine it a day later. This doesn't guarantee perfect decisions, but it reduces the chance of emotionally driven mistakes. Third, cultivate intellectual humility. The more you learn about cognitive biases and psychological models, the more you realize how fallible human thinking is, including your own. This isn't depressing, it's liberating. When you accept that you're biased, you stop defending your biases and start correcting them. You become more curious about being wrong because that's how you learn. Fourth, use pre-commitment and external structures. Since you know you'll face biases in the heat of the moment, create rules and structures in advance. Investors do this with rules like never invest more than 5% of my portfolio in any single stock or always wait 24 hours before selling in response to market drops. These pre-commitments override in-the-moment biases. You can create similar structures for any domain where you know you're vulnerable. Fifth, develop a community of people who will challenge your thinking. Find friends, colleagues, or mentors who are willing to question your assumptions and point out when you're being biased. This is hard because it requires vulnerability and trust, but it's incredibly valuable. Make it safe for people to disagree with you and reward them when they do, even if it's uncomfortable in the moment. The goal isn't to become perfectly rational. That's impossible and probably undesirable. Human emotion and intuition have value. The goal is to become aware of how your mind works, recognize its patterns and limitations, and develop tools to think more clearly when it matters. You're learning to work with your psychology rather than being a victim of it. These models, loss aversion, anchoring, confirmation bias, systems thinking, and feedback loops, are essential tools for that journey. Master them and you'll make better decisions, understand people and situations more accurately, and navigate complexity with more skill and less stress. Chapter 5: Building a Mental Models Mindset for Life. There's a moment that comes to all of us, usually when we're sitting alone in the quiet hours of evening, when we realize that the quality of our lives is determined not by what happens to us, but by how we think about what happens to us. This realization is both humbling and empowering. It strips away the illusion that we're simply victims of circumstance and reveals a profound truth. Our thinking shapes our reality more than our reality shapes our thinking. Consider for a moment the lives of two people facing identical circumstances. Both lose their jobs on the same day at the same company. One spirals into despair, seeing only catastrophe and personal failure. The other, while certainly disappointed, begins to see opportunities that were previously hidden behind the routine of employment. What separates these two people isn't their situation, but their mental models, the invisible frameworks through which they interpret and respond to the world. Mental models are the thinking tools that shape how we perceive reality, make decisions, and solve problems. They are the lenses through which we view the world, and like any lens, they can either clarify or distort what we see. The person who has built a robust collection of mental models doesn't just think differently in moments of crisis, they live differently every single day. They move through the world with a clarity and calm that seems almost supernatural to those who haven't developed this capacity. But there's nothing supernatural about it. It's simply the result of deliberate practice in thinking well. The journey toward building a mental models mindset for life begins with a fundamental shift in perspective. Most people go through their days reacting to events as they unfold, making decisions based on immediate emotions, surface-level observations, or whatever solution first comes to mind. This reactive mode of operation isn't inherently wrong, it's simply limited. It's like trying to build a house with only a hammer. You might be able to drive nails exceptionally well, but when you need to measure, cut, or level something, you're going to struggle. Building a mental models mindset means equipping yourself with a full toolkit of thinking instruments, each designed for different situations and challenges. But more than that, it means developing the wisdom to know which tool to use when, and the discipline to step back and choose deliberately rather than grabbing whatever's closest at hand. Let me share a story about a friend of mine named Marcus who exemplifies this principle. Marcus worked as a middle manager at a manufacturing company, and for years he approached every problem the same way: work harder, push the team more, demand better results. When production fell behind, he'd extend hours. When quality issues arose, he'd implement stricter inspections. When team morale dropped, he'd organize a pizza party. He wasn't a bad manager, he simply operated with a very limited set of mental models. Then one day, after a particularly frustrating quarter where nothing seemed to improve despite everyone's best efforts, Marcus had a conversation with a consultant who asked him a simple question: what if the problem isn't effort, but system design? This question introduced Marcus to systems thinking, a mental model that examines how different parts of a process interact and influence each other over time. Instead of seeing his manufacturing challenges as a series of isolated problems requiring individual fixes, Marcus began to see them as interconnected elements of a larger system. He started mapping out the relationships between different departments. He noticed that the pressure he put on production speed was creating quality issues downstream. He saw that the quality inspections he'd implemented were catching defects but not addressing their root causes. He realized that low morale wasn't a separate problem to be solved with pizza, but a natural consequence of a system that pushed people hard without giving them the authority or resources to actually improve their work. Within 6 months of adopting this systems thinking approach, supplemented by other mental models like second-order thinking and inversion, Marcus transformed his operation. Production improved not because people worked longer hours, but because the workflow was redesigned to eliminate bottlenecks. Quality increased not because of more inspections, but because workers were empowered to stop production and fix problems at their source. Morale lifted not because of parties, but because people felt they were part of a sensible system that valued their intelligence and initiative. What changed wasn't the people or the equipment or even the fundamental nature of the work. What changed was how Marcus thought about the challenges he faced. He had expanded his mental toolkit, and in doing so, he had expanded what was possible. This is the promise of building a mental models mindset, not that life becomes easier, but that you become more capable of navigating its complexity. The challenges don't disappear, but your ability to understand and address them grows exponentially. You begin to see patterns where others see chaos. You anticipate consequences that others miss. You find solutions that others can't imagine because they're still operating with a limited set of thinking tools. Integrating mental models into your daily decisions doesn't require dramatic life changes or hours of study each day. It begins with small, consistent practices that gradually reshape how your mind works. Think of it like learning a new language. At first, you have to consciously translate every word, laboriously constructing each sentence. But with practice, the language becomes natural. You start thinking in it rather than translating into it. Mental models work the same way. The first practice is to slow down your decision-making process, even by just a few seconds. We live in a culture that glorifies quick thinking and rapid-fire responses, but speed is often the enemy of clarity. When you face a decision, large or small, pause and ask yourself, what am I actually trying to accomplish here? What are the likely consequences of this choice, both immediate and down the road? What assumptions am I making? What information might I be missing? These simple questions activate multiple mental models simultaneously. They invoke first principles thinking by making you clarify your actual goal. They trigger second-order thinking by making you consider consequences beyond the immediate. They engage probabilistic thinking by acknowledging uncertainty. They prompt inversion by highlighting potential blind spots. For questions, a few seconds of thought, and suddenly you're not just reacting, you're thinking. I've found that morning routines offer an excellent opportunity to practice this kind of deliberate thinking. Instead of immediately diving into email or social media, which puts you in reactive mode, spend a few minutes with your coffee or tea reviewing your day ahead through the lens of different mental models. Look at your calendar and ask, what are my priorities today? This engages Eisenhower's urgent important matrix, helping you distinguish between what demands attention and what actually matters. Ask, where might I encounter friction or obstacles? This invokes inversion, helping you identify and prevent problems before they occur. Ask, what opportunities might arise? This activates positive visualization and preparedness. This isn't about adding another item to your morning checklist or turning every moment into a productivity exercise. It's about training your mind to naturally operate from a place of clarity and intention rather than reaction and habit. Over time, this mode of thinking becomes automatic. You don't have to remember to use mental models, they become the default way your mind processes information. Another powerful practice is to review decisions after the fact, especially ones that didn't turn out as you hoped. Most people, when faced with a poor outcome, either beat themselves up emotionally or immediately move on, trying to forget the discomfort. Neither approach leads to growth. Instead, examine the decision through the lens of mental models. What information did you have at the time? What models were you using, even unconsciously? What models might have helped you see things more clearly? What can you learn for next time? I remember making a significant career decision several years ago that turned out poorly. I accepted a position that looked perfect on paper, higher salary, impressive title, work that aligned with my skills. Within 3 months, I was miserable. The company culture was toxic, the leadership was dishonest, and the work, while technically in my field, involved none of the aspects I actually enjoyed. I felt foolish for making such an obvious mistake. But when I sat down to review the decision through mental models, I learned something valuable. I realized I had used a very narrow set of criteria: financial compensation and surface-level job description. I had completely ignored second-order effects, like how the work environment would impact my well-being, my relationships, and my long-term career trajectory. I had failed to apply inversion, asking what could go wrong or what would make me want to leave. I had neglected to consider opportunity cost, what I was giving up by taking this position instead of continuing to look for something better. This analysis wasn't about self-flagellation, it was about education. The next time I faced a similar decision, I had a much richer framework for evaluation. I didn't just look at salary and title, I investigated company culture thoroughly, I spoke with current and former employees, I considered how the role would position me for future opportunities, I thought through what failure modes might look like and how probable they were. When I eventually made my next career move, it was based on a much more sophisticated decision-making process, and the results reflected that. Creating a lifelong thinking toolbox is ultimately about becoming a student of reality. It requires curiosity about how the world actually works, not how you wish it worked or how it's supposed to work according to theory. It demands honesty about your own thinking, including your biases, blind spots, and habitual patterns. It calls for humility in the face of complexity and uncertainty. One of the most valuable mental models for lifelong learning is the concept of the learning loop. Instead of seeing life as a series of isolated events, you begin to see it as an ongoing process of hypothesis, experiment, observation, and revision. Every decision becomes a hypothesis about what will happen. Every outcome becomes data. Every experience becomes an opportunity to refine your mental models. Consider someone learning to invest money. A novice might hear that buy low, sell high is the key to success and attempt to time the market based on this simple rule. They buy when they think prices are low, sell when they think prices are high, and often lose money because they're essentially guessing. This approach uses almost no mental models beyond simple pattern recognition. A more sophisticated investor develops a richer framework. They understand compound interest and the power of time in the market. They grasp the concept of regression to the mean and don't assume that recent performance predicts future results. They apply probabilistic thinking and portfolio theory to manage risk. They use inversion to avoid common mistakes rather than trying to find perfect opportunities. They recognize the limits of their knowledge and often choose simple, diversified approaches rather than trying to outsmart the market. Each investment decision is informed by multiple mental models working together, and each outcome teaches them something about which models are most reliable in which contexts. This same principle applies to every domain of life: relationships, health, career, parenting, creative work. The more sophisticated your mental models become, the better you navigate complexity. But sophistication doesn't mean complication. In fact, true mastery often looks simple because the person has internalized their models so deeply that using them requires no apparent effort. Think about an experienced driver navigating rush hour traffic. They're simultaneously monitoring the cars around them, adjusting their speed and position, anticipating the behavior of other drivers, planning their route, and perhaps having a conversation or listening to music. To a new driver, this would be overwhelming, requiring intense concentration on every element. To the experienced driver, it's nearly automatic. They've developed mental models for traffic flow, spatial awareness, and risk assessment that operate below the level of conscious thought. Building a mental model's mindset works the same way. Initially, you have to consciously think about which model to apply. You might literally ask yourself, should I use inversion here? Is this a good time for second-order thinking? This conscious effort is necessary and valuable. But over time, these models become integrated into how you naturally think. You don't decide to consider second-order effects, you automatically wonder about downstream consequences. You don't choose to apply inversion, you instinctively ask what could go wrong. One practice that accelerates this integration is deliberately applying mental models to low-stakes situations throughout your day. When you're watching a movie, try to predict plot developments using base rates and common narrative structures. When you're reading the news, practice separating signal from noise, facts from interpretation. When you're observing an interaction between other people, consider what incentives might be shaping their behavior. When you're planning your evening, think about opportunity costs and what you're choosing not to do. These micro practices might seem trivial, but they're actually building neural pathways. You're training your brain to automatically engage these thinking patterns. When a high-stakes decision arrives, you won't have to consciously remember your mental models, they'll already be active, shaping how you perceive and process the situation. Becoming a clearer, calmer, wiser problem solver is perhaps the greatest gift that mental models offer. Clarity comes from having frameworks that cut through confusion and help you see what's actually happening. Calm comes from confidence in your thinking process and acceptance of uncertainty. Wisdom comes from accumulated experience filtered through sound mental models. I've noticed that people with well-developed mental models exhibit a particular quality in difficult situations. They're present but not panicked, engaged but not reactive. They have what might be called thinking space, a gap between stimulus and response where genuine choice lives. When a crisis hits, instead of immediately acting on their first impulse or emotional reaction, they can pause, consider the situation from multiple angles, and choose a response that serves their actual goals. This doesn't mean they're slow or indecisive. In fact, they often act more quickly than others because they can rapidly assess situations using their mental frameworks. But their speed comes from clarity, not from reaction. They're like a chess master who sees the optimal move almost instantly, not because they're impulsive, but because they recognize patterns from having played thousands of games. Let me tell you about Sarah, an emergency room doctor who embodies this quality. The ER is perhaps one of the most chaotic, high-pressure environments imaginable. Critical decisions must be made constantly, often with incomplete information and severe consequences for error. Yet Sarah moves through her shifts with remarkable composure. She's focused and efficient, but not frantic. She makes rapid decisions, but not rash ones. When I asked her how she manages this, she described her thinking process in terms that perfectly illustrate mental models in action. She talked about using base rates to make initial assessments. Certain symptoms are far more likely to indicate common conditions than rare ones, so she starts there unless evidence suggests otherwise. She described applying Bayesian thinking. As new information comes in, she updates her probability estimates for different diagnoses. She mentioned using inversion constantly. What am I not seeing? What could I be wrong about? What would I expect to observe if my current diagnosis is incorrect? She also talked about something deeper. Acceptance of uncertainty. Sarah knows that medicine always involves incomplete information and probabilistic outcomes. She'll never have perfect certainty, so she's learned to make the best decision possible with available information and then release attachment to being right. This acceptance doesn't make her careless, it makes her clear-headed. She's not paralyzed by the need for certainty because she understands that certainty is often impossible. Instead, she focuses on making sound decisions based on solid thinking. This combination of sophisticated mental models and psychological acceptance is what produces genuine wisdom. You're not just thinking clearly, you're at peace with the inherent uncertainty and complexity of reality. You're doing your best with what you know, knowing that what you know is always limited. This is a very different state than either arrogant confidence or anxious doubt. It's humble clarity. I will think as well as I can, I will act based on my best judgment, and I will accept that outcomes are never entirely under my control. Living with awareness, logic, and inner wisdom means bringing your full consciousness to bear on your life rather than sleepwalking through it. It means recognizing that every moment involves choices, even if those choices are often about how you interpret and respond to circumstances you didn't choose. It means understanding that your thinking is your most powerful tool for shaping your experience and your life. Awareness begins with noticing. You can't improve your thinking if you don't notice your thinking. Throughout your day, develop the habit of observing your own thought patterns. What triggers anxiety in you? What makes you instantly defensive? What causes you to jump to conclusions? When do you feel most clear-headed? When do you tend to make your best decisions? When do you fall into poor thinking habits? This self-observation isn't about judgment, it's about data collection. You're learning about your own cognitive patterns the way a scientist studies a phenomenon. Some people find journaling helpful for this process. Others prefer mental review during quiet moments. The specific method matters less than the consistent practice of paying attention to how you think. Logic means training yourself to recognize sound reasoning and to identify when emotions, biases, or faulty assumptions are driving your thoughts. This doesn't mean suppressing emotions or becoming coldly rational. Emotions carry important information and are a vital part of human experience. But it does mean not letting emotions masquerade as logic. When you feel strongly that something is true, pause and ask, is this based on evidence and sound reasoning, or is this based on how I want things to be or how I fear they might be? I once worked with a man named James who was convinced that his business was failing because of bad luck and unfair competition. Every setback reinforced this narrative. His emotions around the situation were intense, and this intensity made his interpretation feel true. But when we examined the situation using basic mental models, a different picture emerged. We applied first principles thinking. What is a business actually trying to do? Generate value for customers in exchange for revenue that exceeds costs. Was James's business doing this? No. Why not? His product was outdated, his prices were too high, and his customer service was poor. These weren't matters of luck or fairness, they were fundamental business problems. We used inversion. What would make a business fail? ignoring customer feedback, failing to adapt to market changes, spending more than you earn. James was doing all of these things. We examined his incentives. Was he incentivized to confront these problems or to blame external factors? Blaming external factors felt better emotionally and required no difficult changes, so that's what he'd been doing. This logical analysis didn't negate James's emotional experience. His fear and frustration were real and understandable. But it revealed that his emotions were leading him to an incorrect interpretation of his situation, and that incorrect interpretation was preventing him from taking effective action. Once he could see the situation more logically, he could make different choices. The business still faced serious challenges, but now he was addressing actual problems rather than railing against imaginary persecution. Inner wisdom is perhaps the deepest and most subtle aspect of a mental model's mindset. It's the quality that emerges when you've internalized your mental models so thoroughly that they become integrated with your intuition. Your gut feelings become more reliable because they're informed by sophisticated thinking patterns that operate below conscious awareness. This is why experienced people in any field often make what look like intuitive leaps that turn out to be correct. A master craftsman can look at a piece of wood and know how it will behave. An experienced teacher can sense within minutes how a particular lesson approach will work with a particular class. A seasoned negotiator can feel when it's time to push and when it's time to wait. This isn't magic, it's the result of mental models being encoded into intuition through years of practice. You develop this inner wisdom not by avoiding conscious analysis, but by doing so much conscious analysis that it eventually becomes unconscious. It's like learning to play a musical instrument. At first, you consciously think about where to place each finger, how hard to blow or strike or pluck. But eventually, you just hear the music you want to make and your body produces it. The technical knowledge hasn't disappeared, it's been integrated into intuitive action. The same integration happens with mental models. You start by consciously applying frameworks like second-order thinking or probabilistic reasoning. You deliberately practice inversion and first principles analysis. But over time, these ways of thinking become part of who you are. You don't think about using them, you think through them. And when this happens, you gain access to a deeper kind of knowing, one that combines the precision of logical analysis with the holistic insight of intuition. Building a mental model's mindset for life is ultimately an act of self-respect. It's saying that your thinking matters, that the quality of your cognition shapes the quality of your existence, and that you're worth the effort required to think well. It's recognizing that while you can't control everything that happens to you, you can develop extraordinary capacity for understanding and responding to whatever life presents. This doesn't happen overnight. You won't wake up tomorrow as a completely transformed thinker. But if you commit to the practices I've described, if you consistently pause before reacting, if you deliberately apply mental models to daily situations, if you review your decisions and learn from them, if you remain curious about how the world works and honest about how you think, then gradually, steadily, you will change. Your thinking will become clearer. Your decisions will become sounder. Your understanding will become deeper. And your life, shaped by this better thinking, will become richer. The beautiful thing about this journey is that it's endlessly rewarding. Each insight builds on previous ones. Each mental model you master makes the next one easier to learn. Each situation you navigate well increases your confidence and competence for the next challenge. You're not working toward some distant future state of perfection, you're engaging in a process that yields benefits immediately and continuously. A year from now, if you embrace this path, you'll look back at how you think today and marvel at the difference. 5 years from now, the transformation will be even more profound. Not because you'll know all the answers, but because you'll have developed such a rich set of tools for finding answers. Not because life will have become easy, but because you'll have become so much more capable of meeting its difficulty with clarity, calm, and wisdom. This is what it means to build a mental model's mindset for life, to become a person who thinks well, who chooses deliberately, who learns continuously, and who navigates the beautiful complexity of existence with both the precision of logic and the grace of wisdom. The tools are available. The path is clear. All that remains is to begin.